Welcome everyone to this latest in the National Wraparound Initiative's 2013 webinar series. My name is Janet Walker and I co-direct the National Wraparound Initiative together with Eric Bruns, whom you'll be hearing from in just a couple minutes. The webinar today is focused on an exciting and very important topic. It's dealing with new and promising ways to really integrate effective clinical treatment within wraparound. And we'll have a lot of great information, kind of jam-packed presentation, so we'll get on to that really quickly. But just before we do, I want to call your attention to a couple of items here from the information screen. So one is we will be posting both the slides from the webinar and the webinar recording as a whole very, very soon after we're done here today, so you can check in maybe a couple of hours after that. And second, as far as question goes, we'll be taking those by chat, so you can type those in and we'll be reviewing them throughout the presentation. We may have a chance to get to some of them kind of in little spaces during the presentation, and we'll get to others at the end. And so just have patience with your questions. And with that, I would like to hand it off to Eric Bruns to get the webinar started.
All right, well, good morning for those of you on the Pacific Coast, like most of us here, I think all of us on this webinar who are presenting today, and good afternoon to those of you in the rest of the country. This is Eric Bruns. I co-direct the National Wraparound Initiative with Janet Walker. Thanks for that introduction, Janet. And I am here with Bruce Torpeda from University of California, Los Angeles Department of Psychology and PracticeWise, as well as his colleagues from PracticeWise, Adam Bernstein and Seth Ashen, who's also a consultant at Seth Ashen Consulting. And indeed, as Janet led off there, we are going to be talking about the very important and interesting question of how best to coordinate effective clinical services, as well as to integrate research-based options into wraparound plans in general. So a lot of local wraparound initiatives and provider organizations have developed all sorts of ways to ensure that that kind of critical connection to high-quality, effective services is made to wraparound teams and wraparound plans. Today what we're going to do is introduce webinar participants to a exciting approach, one particular and very exciting approach to supporting delivery of clinical care that is both effective as well as flexible and individualized to the needs of youth and families, called the Managing and Adapting Practice System, or MAP. This is something that is provided to the field through PracticeWise, which our colleagues Adam, Bruce, and Seth are all affiliated with, as well as Eric Daleiden, who is listening in as well. So what we're going to do today is speculate on some potential ways that MAP and other flexible, modularized ways of providing evidence-informed services might hold promise for improving outcomes for youth and families enrolled in systems of care and wraparound initiatives. So go ahead to the next slide there, Nancy. The ideas that we're presenting today are very much kind of within the core mission of the National Wraparound Initiative, which is not only to promote understanding of the implementation components and benefits of wraparound, but to be continually working with the field and our community of practice and colleagues to innovate new ways to implement services that are both effective as well as in line with core wraparound principles. So Nancy, if you go to the next slide there, just a reminder that you can go to our website, nwi.pdx.edu, at any time. And as Janet said, all of the slides from this presentation, as well as some other resources about MAP, are available on the website. And we encourage you to join the National Wraparound Initiative. We are partly funded and sustained by memberships from our community of practice. So go to the next slide there. What we're going to do, we've got a lot of stuff we're going to have to try and cover in an hour and a half here. What we're going to do is, first off, do some, I think this webinar really reflects this collaborative effort to try to be continually exploring and trying new things. We're going to talk a little bit about something that I think personally, and a lot of folks have observed in the wraparound world, as an issue, which is the issue of effectiveness of the clinical services that are available to wraparound enrolled youth and families. So a little bit of background on why we might need to pay more attention to that issue. And then, regardless of whether you're working in a kind of wraparound-based system of care or not, we think it'll be real interesting to you all to get an overview of this resource called MAP, this system called Managing and Adapting Practice. So we're going to spend a good amount of time with Bruce and Adam talking about MAP and what the resources are and what kind of a opportunity MAP might provide for systems and provider organizations to enhance their service delivery. Then what we're going to do is speculate a bit about ways in which MAP and WRAP might be coordinated together and what kind of outcomes it might promote, including some initial ideas about that from ourselves as well as Seth Ashen, who works both in a MAP and a wraparound context. And that's pretty much what we're going to try and do today, and we're going to try and do it, like I said, in an hour and a half. Really quick, let's just first launch a poll now that hopefully everyone who's signed up is on, and ask who you are so that we kind of can document and consider who the folks are who are participating as participants today in the webinar. So just go ahead and take about 10 seconds. Click which best describes you. Wraparound manager, supervisor, administrator, partner agency representative, clinician or provider, evaluator or researcher, family member, youth or family and youth advocate. And apologies for only having 5 options, but that's the best that GoToMeeting can do for us. We know there's a lot more roles out there than this. All right, so let's take stock of what we've got. So a lot of folks from wraparound, a lot of wraparound managers and supervisors, and then second would be evaluators and researchers. That's very interesting. Okay, so folks out there in the wraparound world might be interested, it sounds like, in the opportunities that MAP provides. So let's talk a little bit about that first topic, which is why are we thinking about this in wraparound? Next slide. Try to do this quickly. So first off, it's real important to know that the wraparound evidence base continues to grow. We now have 10 published controlled studies of wraparound and a whole lot more quasi-experimental and other evaluations out there that have been done with some rigor. Go to the next slide. This is just kind of trying to make a point here. What we see is that across a lot of different types of outcomes, the effects of wraparound, continue to be very positive, and certainly in the evaluations that are done across the field. And in our controlled research, we see that overall effects of wraparound are significant, particularly in the areas of cost and restrictiveness of living. This shows the effect sizes, and an effect size is basically taking the evaluating as a whole a body of research and asking what is the size of the difference between, or the average size in the effects, or the difference between an experimental condition and some sort of comparison condition. And basically all this is really showing us is that we see these bigger effects in the area of living situation than in the other areas like mental health outcomes, school and community functioning, but it's significant across the board. But it is larger in general for living situation and costs. Go to the next slide. So what we do see is these robust findings from evaluations as well as controlled research around costs and residential outcomes. So again, you can kind of go back and review these slides or review some of the literature on the NWI website to get more detail here. But from evaluations of real standard bearers like Wraparound Milwaukee, this reduction in residential and psychiatric hospitalization days, from controlled studies such as that Catherine Grimes and her colleagues just published, lower emergency room expenses, lower inpatient expenses, a national evaluation done by CMS, cost savings on average from $20,000 to $40,000 estimated by state. Next slide. And again, you'll see these data on the National Wraparound Initiative website in summary documents as well as some of the original evaluation reports. But again, in New Jersey, Maine, Los Angeles County, again, investment in wraparound tends to demonstrate that kids who are enrolled are able to be maintained in the community more consistently and costs are reduced to systems. Go ahead to the next slide. And so as a result, what we see is an increasing emphasis on wraparound by states. Just today, a joint memo was issued by SAMHSA and CMS promoting wraparound intensive care coordination and associated intensive in-home and community-based services to try to maintain youth with serious emotional and behavioral needs in the community. And in addition, we've seen entities such as the Washington State Institute for Public Policy begin to list wraparound as research-based practice. So go ahead to the next slide. So you know, the National Wraparound Initiative is interested certainly not just in proving anything, but also at this point, given that this evidence continues to accumulate, what can we also learn about how to improve what's being delivered? And some things that have interested me in the field is that we do see that research finds bigger outcomes, bigger effect sizes, better outcomes for residential and cost outcomes than things like clinical and functional outcomes. And this is something that has been seen in the system of care research as well. And it does beg the question, you know, are we paying adequate attention to the effectiveness of the clinical services and the other services, along with the nature of the supports, the holistic supports that are provided to youth and families to keep them in home and reduce costs. We also conducted a randomized study that's about to be published that found a similar result, that we found better residential outcomes for the wraparound group, but actually a traditional case management group, kids randomly assigned to traditional case management in the system of care actually showed better clinical outcomes. And we speculated based on what we learned in that system that it might have been that case management entity was able to better coordinate and integrate clinical care into the plans of the youth that were receiving this intervention, this alternative to wraparound. So one question that we ask is, you know, is there a lack of specificity about how we might use research evidence, whether for clinical care or for plan of care development, and is there some concern that that might reduce our ability to produce these kind of clinical and functional outcomes? Does it reduce our efficiency? You know, do we not generate improvement in kids who have specific clinical needs, symptoms, and functioning as fast as we could? Does it even perhaps, the lack of specificity about how to use research evidence potentially reduce the quality of options for families and teams? And just a few things that might additionally make us think that this might be something we need to pay attention to. I'm going to review those now. So one thing is that, you can go ahead and flip through all of the different boxes here, Nancy. So one thing just to look at is the theory of change for wraparound really describes a lot of different routes to positive outcomes, a lot of which talk about primarily building family assets by providing this very youth and family-driven, team-based, very supportive kind of process that youth and families traditionally don't get access to in our public mental health system. So we build family build family assets, as well as make sure that the services that are in the plan are things that will work for the family, and we problem solve barriers that might be posed to ensuring access to the services, engagement in the services. But what isn't really in the theory of change for wraparound that much is the nature of the services themselves, and whether or not they are in fact based on evidence generated by research about what will work for a specific problem area. Next slide. So just to kind of summarize the theory of change, so that's one kind of way of looking at whether or not there's something that we're missing in wraparound that could be enhanced. Another thing that we can look at is this notion that effective wraparound teams really require supportive organizations as well as hospitable systems. And those hospitable systems really do need to have a service array in place that is capable of meeting the needs of families. If you have wraparound teams that don't have an adequate array of supports, high-quality supports to put into those plans, then you could be, creating a donut hole where you don't have anything to wrap, so to speak. So this is something that we've seen in a lot of systems where there's really very dedicated and hardworking wraparound organizations who aren't necessarily surrounded by a service array or have access for their wraparound enrolled families to effective services, including clinical services. Next slide. And finally, one thing that we've learned from research is that certain principles are associated with, achieving certain principles in wraparound are associated with better outcomes. And there's several studies out there that found that scores on the Wraparound Fidelity Index in the area of being outcomes-based as well as connection to natural supports, so ensuring that goals are being set, priority needs are being identified, and progress is monitored over time, as well as that natural and community supports are present and have clear roles, that these things are really critically important to outcomes. These are some things that have been specifically found to be better associated with outcomes than other things. So all that to be said, go ahead to the next slide there. Go ahead, I think I've already summed this up. Go ahead to the next one there. We're asking questions based on things we've heard from the field, as well as this, some of this research data, that it may be important for us to really take a fresh look at how to more systematically coordinate research-based care or evidence-based care, or just ensure that wraparound teams have, are adequately considering what are research-based options for meeting needs into the wraparound process. And in working with a few provider organizations here in Washington State and elsewhere, we've really kind of taken a shine to this idea that among the many options for making those good connections to effective clinical care, that the managing and adapting practice system might be one option for systems of care and wraparound initiatives to consider. And so what we're going to talk about in the rest of this webinar, after we get a little bit of an introduction to MAP and its approach to trying to mobilize research on what works for kids and families, we've got kind of four big ideas about how we might be able to improve this. We don't have a whole lot of specifics, just to make sure you know this from the outset. No sort of like, training manual or specific intervention per se that says, here's how you do this. We think that this is something that's going to be left up to local systems to consider how they might achieve these things. But here are some ideas that we're working with in a few kind of initial adopter pilot sites. One is, can we have the research base more consistently consulted with or referred to when we generate strategies to meet youth and family needs during the wraparound planning process, or in the middle of the implementation phase of wraparound when teams may be getting stuck or progress is stalling out. A second really straightforward thing is, can we support clinicians who are affiliated with wraparound programs to use effective practices more consistently that might connect to the youth and families' priority needs and align with and be done in a way that really reflects wraparound principles? That's the second big idea. The third, because we know that it's critically important, not just that natural and community supports are present on teams or involved in the process, but that they have clear roles. Is there anything we can do to provide family and youth peer partners who are increasingly present in wraparound initiatives and increasingly engaged in the process? Can we provide those folks, mentors and community supports, with some sort of support or training to reinforce any sort of research-based strategies that are integrated into plans of care? And then finally, something that has actually been found across all sorts of different kinds of human services as well as health services to be critically important. One thing that just accounts for so much variance in outcomes in research is whether or not you have clear goals and you're monitoring progress towards those goals. Can we do that more consistently? Because we see that the outcomes-based principle of wraparound is one of those that is consistently one of the lowest scoring principles on our fidelity checks. So go on to the next slide. And with that, the question here is how? And again, we're not proposing that this is, the answer or even necessarily yet an effective answer. But what we're going to do now is kind of look at the managing and adapting practice system as an option for systems of care and wraparound initiatives, as well as anyone else who's on the phone who's interested in ways to maybe improve the degree of research that is reflected in their clinical care. But with respect to wraparound, what we're going to do as well today in the rest of this webinar is ask how might we in fact pull those big ideas off? How could we generate evidence-based strategies in planning? How might we support clinicians who are affiliated with wraparound programs to use EBP? How might we help family and youth partners and other community supports to reinforce research-based strategies or serve as care extenders? And how might we give folks tools that they can use to monitor progress and practice more consistently so that we can make that outcomes-based principle of wraparound really come to life? So with that, first we're going to do another poll question, and then I'm going to hand it over to Bruce Chorpita and Adam Bernstein from PracticeWise to talk about MAP. But let's launch the next poll question, and we'll see what folks' response is to this question. What role do evidence-based practices or research-based practices have in your system of care or your wraparound initiative? And again, we're limited by the number of options we can provide, and unfortunately there's no open-ended options. But select the one that makes most sense for you, that EBP is not an emphasis. Maybe one or two manualized evidence-based treatments are available in your system. Maybe you have 3 or more EBTs available in your system or your wraparound initiative or available to your wraparound teams. The fourth option would be that you're using a flexible or modularized approach to EBP, which is what MAP is kind of generally described as. And then the fifth option is you're seeking to build more evidence-based practice, but you're still investigating how you might do that. So let's see what folks are saying to this, and then we're going to hand it over to our colleagues from PracticeWise. So what we see here is that actually the biggest vote getter was that flexible or modularized approaches to EBP is really the most common approach, and the second most common is that where folks are still investigating options. So that's kind of cool, because that means that perhaps 56% of the participants are trying to do this or thinking about what they might do. So what do you think of that, Bruce? I'm going to hand it over now to Bruce Chorpita.
Great, thank you, Eric. I think it's interesting. I'm looking at those results too. It looks like if you sum 2 of those bars, about 40% of groups or folks on the call have some 2 or more evidence-based programs available in their system, so that there's a good chunk of folks out there who have some kind of an evidence-based service array, and then the question is how that array fits. It also, the fact that 30% bar showed people are using evidence-based practices in a flexible way is interesting. We just finished a study showing after we did we trained folks how to use evidence-based practices in a big community-based trial. What we did was, when the study was over, we asked therapists who were trained in evidence-based practices what they were doing, and it turns out it's consistent with that 30% group of folks who are continuing to use the treatment protocols, but using them in a way that was more individualized, more modular, and they were kind of using certain parts but not all the parts and things like that. So so as you'll see, and we can move to the next slide, MAP really touches on this particular idea. So why consider MAP? So first of all, just in listening to all the wonderful things Eric said so far, it occurred to me that I should emphasize right off the bat that there is no agenda here to use research-based treatments for the sake of that. And that MAP is really not about saying we're going to use research because that's our goal, but rather it's about it's using research as a strategy to meet the goal of helping youth and families lead better lives. And so what is it? Why would we even consider this? Well, it's to begin with, this system was developed maybe 15 years ago now in a statewide system of care. So it was developed in a community setting, not in a laboratory setting, to deal with youth with complex needs and highly individualized circumstances. And it was really built to address service quality problems. It wasn't part of a mandate to use evidence-based practices per se. And the MAP system is in fact not really a treatment itself. it's probably best thought of as a system to support thinking and decision-making and taking promising actions by youth, families, service providers, case managers, so team members. And that's really all it is. It's an architecture to help people make better decisions, take better guesses, make better choices, and then when those choices aren't working, to recognize that quickly, to adapt and correct, and to move on. Let's go to the next slide, and I'll get into some more of the details about that. So what we were dealing with as MAP evolved was this idea that there is lots of evidence that evidence-based treatments could be helpful, right? There's now approximately 700 randomized trials showing that these clinical and functional outcomes that Eric said showed us that are so hard to achieve. A lot of those clinical outcomes have been achieved in these randomized trials. So there's, the idea certainly is, this shouldn't be new to anybody, that there's something there, right, that we should pay attention to. But so it hasn't been about the evidence, it's really been about fit, and in our view of, how have efforts to disseminate evidence-based practices struggled a bit, it has been with this issue of fit, both in terms of principles and philosophy and other aspects as well. So just to list some of them here, one of the issues that we always had to contend with implementing evidence-based practices is this notion of bundling practices, settings, measures, and things together, so that once you pick an evidence-based program, it's kind of an all or nothing. You have to get everything along with it, use all the practices, it's meant for a specific setting only, and it uses certain measures and so forth. And it makes it difficult for individualized family choice, context fitting, and so forth. We also discovered that many youth are not eligible for evidence-based practices, so we've done a couple of studies recently looking at if you take all the youth in a service system, how many of them would be eligible for or have characteristics similar to those youth who participated in all of these 700 studies. And it turns out, on average, there's about a quarter to a third of kids in the systems we've looked at so far who wouldn't have qualified for those studies and therefore wouldn't qualify for these evidence-based programs as well. So thinking from the system side, we've always thought we need to come up with a solution that works for all youth and families, as well as those who didn't or wouldn't respond or wouldn't achieve the desired clinical or functional outcomes from evidence-based programs. So those folks who may try something that's evidence-based, we know that there's a portion of those that might not respond, and those youth are going to continue to need supports. And the question is, well, what are those supports, right? What would they look like if they're not evidence-based programs? Is there something close or similar? And then there's this other issue on the relative emphasis of general knowledge, what's in studies and using research for research's sake, versus local knowledge of what are the local youth family preferences, what do we know about the youth history, what do we know about individual youth's response to a particular set of practices and so forth. And so we've really struggled to try to address these issues and come up with a system that balances the ability to reason about what's happening locally and what ideas have been discovered in the literature, and to try to create flexible options for all youth and families in the system. So let's go to the next slide. So really, we're trying to throw out the bathwater, not the baby. So I have a picture. That's now a very old picture of my daughter watching my son take a bath. So we don't want to throw out the baby. There's something to evidence-based programs or practices that we believe is helpful, right? That they're getting these outcomes in certain contexts, and we don't want to ignore that. But there's also a lot of other things that come along with it. So we tried to move toward this notion of an a la carte approach of unpacking the knowledge. What is it in these studies that we could think about to give us ideas that are separate from the fully bundled, fixed kind of products that have resulted from the evidence-based treatment movement, right? So is it possible, without using the product, to use some of the knowledge that is contained within it, or the knowledge that's represented in all those studies? And we believe that it's possible to do that. So again, MAP is really about informing choices and enhancing collaboration and communication, providing structures to do that with dedicated tools and resources. So let me go through some examples of what those look like on the next slide here. And this slide represents one of the, this notion of unpacking the knowledge. One of the features for which MAP is relatively well known is this idea of getting at the practice knowledge within the evidence-based treatment. So typically when we think about evidence-based protocols, there are these kind of brand name packaged, kind of bundled entities. So I've listed a few of them here. Incredible Years. Folks are probably familiar with these. PCIT and Defiant Children. Let's go to the next piece here. And then, those would all be examples of a parent training or parent management, which is what they're called in the research literature, parent training protocols, which work with parents to support their use of parenting practices that tend to lead to better clinical and functional outcomes. What we've tried to do, let's click one more time, is to say, let's look at these, and these are 3 of about 45 or so that are evidence-based, and see, are there practices, what we call practice elements, are there components to these effective protocols that are shared across many? And in fact, so this slide is not comprehensive. It's meant to illustrate more the relationship of practice elements to protocols. But what we find is when we look at dozens of protocols, and you kind of get so many, it's sort of difficult to know, well, which one should we use or which one should we choose. What we find is that many of the effective protocols have some of the same practice elements within them. And so what we thought many years ago now was we might take a look at some of these particular elements or strategies and use them in a more targeted or flexible manner to say, are there, so there's some examples here, are rewards or attending, are there specific procedures we could use within an episode of care that might help us achieve a particular goal? So let's go to the next slide. So how do we do that? As Eric said, how do we get that research at people's fingertips when they're planning? So one of the tools, and I know Adam's going to go through this in a bit more detail later, we have this way of providing that literature at people's fingertips. This evidence-based services database has now approximately 700 randomized trials that represent specific strategies. It not only tells you treatments that match a particular youth characteristic, like age, problem, ethnicity, setting, various characteristics of a youth that you could enter, or goals, needs, and so forth. You enter those features, and what's returned to you is an aggregate report of, across the entire literature, these are the practices that are most relevant. These are the effective practices that are most relevant for this particular youth. So you get essentially an ingredients list or an idea list for these are strategies that in research have been parts of successful protocols that you may want to consider. So let's go to the next slide. As Eric said too, again, this is about trying to create structures to come up with promising ideas, and then we need to know, are those ideas working? What have we tried? How is it working? Do we need to adapt? Do we need to correct? And as I mentioned earlier, balancing this notion of local knowledge and how do we introduce local knowledge into the decision making, we have this with this resource called the Clinical Dashboard, which is essentially a workspace or communication tool. And what it allows folks to do is to see on the top panel there, you see that's a progress panel that shows 2 plots there of particular goals, progress towards goals changing over time. And that bottom panel is the practice history, which can reflect a lot of other things as well. It can reflect who's on the team, who's involved, and so forth. Very commonly, we use it to reflect practice history of which practices have been tried at various times. Those dots refer to a particular event or practice covered at a particular point in time. So it lets us think not only about the literature, but to think, what have we done so far, and how is it working? And if it's working, great, but if it's not, we may need to correct and try some other ideas, go back to the literature. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so in trying to back off from this idea of having everything bundled, we went to a place where we said, let's get ideas from the literature, and we were really hesitant to try to overbuild, because when you overbuild, you then can't individualize, right? If you have a manual that's sort of a highly detailed and so forth, and it's kind of linear in nature, it gets very difficult to individualize. And so this was sort of a second wave with MAP, where we originally were kind of recommending these various practices, and folks were saying, we want more detail and more structure in how to do these. So we have these dedicated resources now we've been using for maybe the past 7 years or so for how to structure various decisions about what to do. So how do we build a treatment plan? How do we revise that plan? How do we know who should get together? So this, these are just on the left. Actually, I think if you can click a couple more times, these labels will pop up. So what we call process guides are kind of like recipe cards for who should be there, what should we be thinking about, what should we be looking at to make a decision. And on the right, we have these practice guides so that if you actually wanted to use one of these strategies from the evidence base, there's a checklist and details about how to do those steps, which folks can consider if they are relevant and seem promising. Let's go to the next slide. So just to wrap up this section here, really what we're looking for, as Eric said, we don't have a preconceived notion of how all this is going to fit together, but we are looking for opportunities to improve things, right? We're trying to look at, we're taking up the promising wraparound model with all the positive outcomes that we've seen and saying, how can we build on some of the things that we'd like to see improve? And can we take a sort of flexible system for leveraging knowledge from evidence-based practices and use that to add ideas and add structure in places where we could use more structure? And we're hoping to discover as we do this what is the best way to try to coordinate these things working together. Let's go one more slide just because I'm not sure what's coming next here. So this is, I think at this point I'm going to turn this over to Adam, who is going to give a bit more detail on MAP and how it works.
Great. Well, thank you, Bruce, and hello to everyone. And yes, I'll be talking about MAP, which, as Bruce said earlier, is not a treatment, but rather a system or toolkit for collaboratively designing care that meets a family's needs. So that's why this slide here talks about MAP as a knowledge management approach. We're trying to provide information and knowledge to help support collaborative decision making. Okay, next slide, please. And this is that same table of our big ideas that Eric showed earlier. And over the course of this presentation, we're going to try to fill in these columns for you here. Eric talked about the ideas to start us out, and now we're going to talk about these MAP tools that are going to fit into to helping achieve some of these. So what are the MAP tools and resources? Next slide, please. You can think of MAP as a kit for putting together care that has important qualities from the evidence base, but it's designed by you, the family, the team, and that incorporates a bunch of different kinds of evidence. Next slide. So to get at how we collaboratively design care around a family's vision, we need to break down the questions involved. So the orange diamonds in the model I'm going to show represent some of the common core questions. In terms of clinical interventions, we have to decide the setting where we're going to provide treatment. And what are we going to do once the youth is there? It's not enough to know that they're in residential or getting intensive in-home. We need to know what practices we're actually going to do in that setting. Next slide. And are we doing it well? That's the integrity diamond here. Is there some way of knowing what this should look like when it's done well? And similarly, we need to know whether what we're doing is working. Are we making progress? That's the diamond at bottom right. Next slide. And now bringing in the people part of the model, who's going to provide the care? Who's on the team? What formal and informal supports does this family need? And how will the process be managed? So these are fundamental questions that need to get answered one way or another. Next slide. And the next thing I'm going to bring in is the evidence, represented by my blue parallelograms at left here. And what I want to show is that there are different paradigms out there for making these decisions based on different evidence. The EBT model, for one, tends to let the treatment research guide what the treatment team does. And that also structures all those decisions out to the right, which I'll give an example of in just a moment. Next slide. But there's other common ways to use evidence. For example, individualized care often balances clinical theory, that top blue one, with evidence from the individual case, like how's the child doing? Clinical theory says that rewards increase behavior, the child's not going to school, so I'll try giving rewards and maybe he'll start going to school. Next slide. And throwing one more in the mix here, another source of local evidence comes from aggregated cases, that upper blue shape here. That represents what we know about the local population and the local system. So if I know that a particular residential home has a super high rate of elopement and the teen I'm working with is a runaway risk, that's important evidence that's going to guide my decision making even though it's not published anywhere. Next slide. And MAP is built to help you put all of these together. You can see that I've got all the blue evidence shapes at once now, and the point is that good ideas can come from all of these places. Both the generalized evidence, knowledge and theory and treatment research, and the local knowledge of what's happening in my particular context and what's going on with this child and family. As a care building kit, MAP helps a team to use all of these to make decisions live as care is going along. So we'll give some more specific examples in a moment of how all that information gets structured and delivered into the situations where decisions are getting made so it can guide care. Next slide. But first I want to point out that in the EBT model, these decisions all tend to be bundled together, as Bruce was mentioning. When you pick a treatment program, it drives all these decisions. And to represent that in the model here, I've taken out all the blue evidence shapes and left and introduced the red diamond in the middle for the treatment program because it's mediating all those decisions. Next slide. So here's an example of CBITS, a school-based trauma treatment. We do a lot of training in CBITS in California, and you can see that by choosing CBITS here, I've decided not only the setting and the practices, but also all those other decisions about how I'll measure and manage care. And that can be great, but the problem comes in if only some parts of that fit a family. If you're not in a school setting, say, you may not be able to get CBITS, and we can't unbundle these decisions to make them fit with the reality of a child and family's needs. You can't order a la carte or get even a customized combo meal. You have to really get the prefix meal here, and that might not work. Next slide, please. So what we've thought about is how can we take the family vision, targets, and goals, which is the orange center diamond now, and let that drive all these decisions out to the right rather than bundling them all together. So for example, we're in a school, say, so I can't change that, but my team wants to do the practices from a treatment that's never been tested in school. It involves rewards, and hey, I think rewards may work in a school even though the research was in a clinic. So I'm starting to customize my combo meal here. We're starting to pick some of these things that seem like a good fit and configure them. We're trying to inform choices that seem reasonable and grounded in evidence. And that's what MAP aims to do, to inform choices and enhance collaboration and communication about care. In Wraparound in particular, usually the prefix meal isn't going to work for you. You need to be able to pick the pieces that make sense for a family's needs. Next slide. Okay, now let's go from that abstract model to checking out some of the practical tools that MAP provides. Next slide. So MAP is a kit for informing decisions so that you're grounded in evidence. They're grounded in evidence, but they're made by you, the family, the team. And that kit has to have a bunch of different parts. And one of them is that you want to know what's in the research. If you're going to help the current family, it's good to know what's helped other kids like this. So we do ongoing review of the research. Every 6 months we're reading and adding studies. We triple code each study and all the protocols involved. And as this slide shows, we're up over 700 randomized trials now. Next slide. And that really would be information overload for anyone trying to read those 1,000+ manuals from all those studies. You can see this poor therapist, he's never going to get to meet with Maggie, his client. No one person can read and take in all of that. Next slide. But MAP provides a tool, a searchable database called PWebs that has all that information and can summarize the parts of it that are most relevant to a particular child. This slide shows that I just enter in some criteria like one of the problem areas a child is struggling with and their age, along with things like ethnicity and setting if I want, and click View Results. Next slide. And just about instantly, I get back a bunch of information. So here I've done a search for an 8-year-old with emotional behavioral goals concerning disruptive behavior. I get a summary of the evidence from all the studies that included kids with those characteristics. It summarizes those broad types of treatment that have been shown to work, the treatment families that Bruce mentioned earlier, along with format and setting. But the part I've highlighted is that it shows the practice elements too, the specific clinical procedures and how often they showed up in the treatments that worked. That tends to be the level that therapists are most interested in for building a plan because of all the adaptation it allows to fit a particular family. So here I can see that for my search for the 8-year-old with disruptive behavior, Teaching caregivers about praise was the most common practice. It was in 92% of the treatments that worked. And rewards and timeout and others aren't far behind. So right off the bat, I've got a bunch of ideas I might offer or discuss with this family. Next slide. But of course, that's not enough. We still have to know the basic steps for how to teach praise or rewards, etc. So the second big tool I want to show gets at that. Bruce mentioned it. It's that practice guide, these real short summaries of how to do each of those clinical procedures. Each one fits on two sides of a single page. Next slide. Here's what they look like. Here's one for problem solving, but they all have the same parts. They show what it is, when to use it, who it's for. Next slide. And then there's the steps. There's a checklist of main steps on the left, along with details of how to do each step on the right. And experts tend to just use the checklist. Beginners tend to like the details. Hey, I don't know exactly what it means to normalize. Well, here's how to do it. And there's an online version of this, too, that's interactive, so you can turn off the parts you don't want to see. Next slide. But it's important to emphasize that we don't believe you can just deconstruct treatment into elements, because there's recipes that matter a lot too. If I told you we're going to make brownies at my house and we'll just put all this stuff in the picture into a bag and mush it around, you wouldn't come over, of course. We know that recipes matter, and they can be pretty sophisticated. Next slide. So we tried to summarize the most common recipes in the literature too. Here's an example. There tends to be a focus interference distinction. One of the things that characterizes EBTs is that you focus on something and you only manage interference when it's getting in the way of that focus, whereas usual care tends to follow the lead of what's happening this week. Next slide. Within that focus, there's connect and engage phase at the beginning, a teaching and cultivating skills phase, and then this consolidate phase where we generalize and review, and that's kind of a general recipe. Next slide. So we take these elements and we add them to a recipe like this, and it starts to come together as a plan that has structure but can also adapt as we need to. Here's an example for depression showing how this might look. I won't get into the details. Next slide. Here's another recipe. This one's for how to plan a session. Again, I won't get into the details here, but it shows what we do before, during, and after a session. We have about a dozen recipe cards for like this, recipes for different aspects of making treatment happen. Next slide. One last one, just to show this one is specific to how to adapt to meet a child and family's needs. Adapting for all the various factors, not just ethnic diversity, but views and preferences, setting where the treatment is happening, really just about anything that might get in the way of the standard thing working. Next slide. So we're using these ideas and recipes to build a treatment that's live and changing from one family to the next. And so the next big question that comes up is it working? Well, we really don't know if anything works for a particular child and family, even a structured EBT, unless we measure it live. So another big focus of MAP is monitoring live. Next slide. We have this tool called the clinical dashboard, and it lets you look at progress ratings to see how kids are doing. That's the top half. Are you meeting your goals or not? In this case, there's a couple of depression scales being plotted up there with the pink and blue line, and they're going down, which happens to be good. And below is the practice pane. On the left, it's hard to see, but there's the names of the various procedures that you're using, things like the rewards and praise we saw in the search earlier on PWebs. So this gets at the question of, how do I know if it's working up top? But also, what do I do if it's not? For example, here, I can look at this quickly and say, oh, this looks like CBT for depression, and it looks like it's working. And if it's not working, you can look at the practices I've been using and say, hey, you haven't tried relaxation yet. That might be an idea to consider. So you might be able to pick off something I haven't tried yet that's often used in effective treatments for depression and say, hey, that's a good candidate to bring up at the next team meeting. Actually, relaxation already has a couple sessions on the board here, but you might be able to find something that makes sense. So you can see this helps us to self-correct if things aren't going well. We're able to see multiple data sources together live here, so we can talk about how things are going and why, and design together in real time. Next slide. So here depression score is getting better. Nice. Next slide. And here I can see that there's an engagement problem. 3 months of no diamonds, no family participation, and then another 6 weeks of the same. So if we're not making progress, maybe it's not a practice issue, it might be an engagement issue. All right, so to summarize, we're getting to explore the local evidence from this child and family about their goals, progress over time, and team involvement, and we think that's just as high a priority as the evidence from research. Next slide. All right, and I'll hand back over to Eric to talk about how the RAP map ideas might be achieved.
Right, so first off, one thing that's really compelling about MAP is that, wraparound is typically something that a system considers to try to, as Pat Miles has said, if you know what to do, do it. If you don't know what to do wraparound. And, for kids with multiple and complex needs, that's something that every system needs a solution to. And wraparound teams provide that solution, especially for youth and families who are at risk of out-of-home placement and bad outcomes such as that also cost the system a lot of their resource. Wraparound is often invested in to provide that way of making sure that there's a flexible team-based way of responding to needs in a very flexible and individualized way that's going to get better outcomes. And so one thing that really resonates about MAP is that, it certainly is primarily, I think it's fair to say it's been primarily used for community-based clinical services, outpatient therapy and so forth. But it really reflects so many principles of wraparound, and certainly that idea that you need to have as many good ideas as possible, because a real-world youth and family is not going to present with a real straightforward picture that you can just plug a manual into and fix. It's individualized and flexible. It's certainly very outcomes-based in that it's drawing from research strategies as well as integrating this dashboard kind of progress monitoring piece. And it explicitly elevates, the youth and family and their preferences and their history over any sort of rigid approach, while still ensuring that knowledge about what is likely to work is used by the therapist or the provider. So, in and of itself, it seems on the surface as something that would be something that's very much in line with system of care principles and wraparound principles, and something that a service system might want to invest in along with wraparound. The question is, so that's all well and good. So you may very well find this compelling. You may already be doing it. It looks like 30% of folks out there are trying to do some sort of modular or flexible approach to evidence-based practice. What we've been asking is what might be some enhancements to, some ways of bridging or coordinating the MAP tools and resources and approach explicitly into wraparound contexts or systems of care. So go ahead to the next slide there, Nancy. So, we took a little peek at some of these big ideas about what might be ways in which MAP could be connected to wraparound initiatives. What are some things that we might do to do better coordination of the two operating systems, so to speak? And one thing that, when I kind of started discussing, there's two organizations here in Washington State that have been generous enough to think about this idea because they're interested in improving the nature of their clinical care that's provided to their wraparound families. And one of the things that they really resonated with them is using that P-webs, those searchable database, as a way to, at strategic points in the planning or implementation process, to generate more good ideas. So one idea is just generating research-based options in planning and implementation of phases of wraparound. Not necessarily for every single youth, not in absence of the youth or the team's participation, but at times when folks have clearly identified clinical needs that could be met through clinical services that are tailored to meet that need, and treatment strategies that have been found to be effective in research, is something that is viewed as being potentially beneficial to that youth and family around achieving their vision for the future and meeting their needs. So when a clinical need is obvious, or when a team is stuck and looking for options, when progress has stalled out, using P-web searches at strategic points. And that would necessarily mean, doing some degree of kind of orientation and training to relevant folks who are serving on wraparound teams to do that in partnership with the team. Another thing that they saw in terms of the MAP resources is that the practice guides could be potentially very beneficial to help increase transparency and clarity of purpose of whatever the referral to clinical service is. So the practice guides would help orient the family and team to what the clinician is doing. What Janet learned through some early research on wraparound almost 10 years ago is that I think close to 100% of wraparound plans in over a dozen different wraparound initiatives that they looked at, over 100 wraparound plans, every single one of them had some sort of therapy included. Well, are those therapists always meaningfully connected to the needs of the family? Does the team really understand how that clinical service fits into the overall strategies that are in the plan of care? The practice guides could help that, and it could deepen the planning process to also include brainstorming of the barriers that might be posed by whatever the work is that the clinician is doing or is being referred to in the follow-on supports. So in essence, the P-webs could help wraparound teams procure services more carefully in a way that's more matched with needs and increase the overall transparency and clarity of purpose of clinical service. As well as just generally put good strategies out there into the team context to think about. It wouldn't necessarily have to be around the clinical care, but if a need for a youth, for instance, is to have more fun at school and make friends, but this young person has anxiety to the degree that he or she is barely able to leave their room and get out from in front of their computer, a P-web search would generate all sorts of options that aren't necessarily clinical as well that the team might consider to incorporate into the plan of care. Pleasant event scheduling, exposure, and all those things might be strategies that are used by the team broadly as well as things that the team might go procure from clinical services. So this is the first big idea. Go ahead to the next slide there. So obviously the second idea is just once those referrals are made, let's ask whether the clinician is has an orientation to using the research base in a way that's going to make their work with the youth and family as effective as possible. So the second big idea is just making sure that any wraparound initiative or system of care has clinicians who are trained on some sort of system like MAP, orientation to treatment elements that have been found to work for common problems, and ask whether or not a wraparound initiative can invest in some sort of training and certification of their clinicians in something like MAP. And Adam's going to talk a little bit more about that.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so we were talking earlier about MAP being a system to try to help inform decisions. And so I want to talk a little bit about how MAP supports clinicians to use all those different types of evidence we've been talking about to connect with youth and families' priority needs. This slide, it shows another recipe. We call it the MAP. Within MAP, there's the MAP. And this guides a clinician to determine what evidence might be most important to consider at any given time for the current needs of a family. It'll give you some ideas. So the diamonds down the center refer to common decisions or questions. The rectangles at right refer to actions that follow those decisions. And the document shapes at left refer to sources of information used to guide decisions. I want to point out from the start that all this is customizable. There is no one MAP. Instead, the idea is to use the questions and resources relevant to your own team. And being on the MAP is really about knowing what the current decisions are and what evidence to look at to inform them. So next slide, please. The MAP starts out by prompting us to consider if client info or prep is needed, and if so, points us to do the initial engagement and assessment of family strengths, needs, culture, and vision. Next slide. Once we're past that, it asks whether the vision or plan is focused. Remember that focus is one of the trademark qualities of effective clinical care. So if we answer that we need more focus, it points us to check out the P-webs for ideas and to look to the plan of care. Next slide. Here's that same MAP episode planner we saw earlier, but with the NWI wraparound phases built in. So are we focused in getting into the phases? Did we make it to implementation, or are we stuck at plan development? Next slide. Dropping down a row, the map prompts us to consider if engagement or crisis are current blockers. And the photo of Oscar the Grouch here is pointing out that often you don't need to look too far to get evidence of that. It might be sitting in the room with you. But the safety and crisis plan is another important source of information here. And we saw earlier, too, that the dashboard can help us spot engagement trouble. Next slide. Here's that same dashboard figure we saw earlier, and I can see real quick that there's been big gaps without participation here. No diamonds showing up for months at a time, which means no contacts with the family. So I've got another source of evidence of poor engagement. Next slide. And here's the spot everyone's working to get to, clinical progress, right in the middle of the map. And at left, it shows that this is only meaningful in the context of family vision. Again, if you flip to the next slide, of course, I'm going to put targets and goals connected to that vision onto my dashboard so I can see progress right at the top. Next slide. So progress was looking good there, but if it weren't, I'd keep going down the line on the map and getting more ideas for how to proceed. And next it asks, do I have the right practices? Next slide. So if progress isn't good, I can check out whether the practices I've been using fit the problem. And if not, I've got a whole list of ideas from the PWebs that I can bring to the next team meeting to discuss with the family and team. Next slide. And finally, is it being done with quality? If progress is poor, but it looks like I've got the right practices, here's some ideas for how to improve the quality of how I'm doing them and add any needed supports. Okay, I know that was a whirlwind tour, but the take-home is that therapists are supported to guide each decision with sources of information. So being on the map is really about informed or evidence-based decision-making. Next slide. Okay, and now back to Eric.
Right. So, bottom line around potentially training clinicians in a wraparound initiative to use MAP would just be that, a clinician with an orientation to the resources and the overall approach of MAP, may very well be better capable of both using effective practices as well as doing things that are going to enhance outcomes for kids, including, consulting with all of the different resources that a wraparound team can bring to bear for a kid and family. All right, we can try and move along pretty quickly here. But our third idea, if you remember our ideas, is this is a really innovative and exciting one that was brought up by both of the provider organizations that I've been working with here in Washington who are doing wraparound and interested in MAP, is could we in fact support or train parent partners, youth peer support partners, and other community supports to serve as evidence-based practice care extenders, so to speak. So when strategies in that that are generated that are coming out of resources such as the PWebs, those different evidence-based practice elements or strategies, if they're integrated into the plan of care, can we perhaps use the MAP resources to orient or even train peer support partners, paraprofessionals to kind of follow up with some of those strategies? So if in fact a therapist is doing some sort of exposure in their office around school phobia, can the parent partner or youth partner participate in the process of actually doing that in vivo in school, expose the youth to different faculty or situations in school that are causing them great anxiety? Could in fact a parent support partner help model some of the skills in vivo because they're spending 3 or 4 hours in the home as opposed to 1 or 2 with the family on things like praise or attending when a youth is demonstrating disruptive behaviors in the home that are making life really difficult for the family. So this is something that is an interesting idea that the MAP system provides a potential architecture to provide. Go on down to the next slide there. There are a number of the 45 practice elements in the MAP system that one could imagine would be really relevant for paraprofessionals, peer support partners, in-home aides to get training on along with the clinicians so that they could serve as appropriate follow-on resources or supports around strategies. Things like commands or effective instructions, You could imagine folks being in the home helping follow through with some of the skills that were being developed in a therapist's office, praise, rewards, and so forth. So one thing that we're thinking about is, can we customize some of the training that's currently primarily for more formal service providers to, in particular, family support partners who are so often involved in wraparound teams and in wraparound systems? And one of the reasons we're pursuing this is not just because, it's an interesting idea, but because in the couple of kind of conversations I've had with WRAP implementing organizations that use parent partners and youth partners, they were incredibly enthusiastic about this idea because it would help provide them with greater specificity about what their role is in improving the well-being of the family, in helping them live a better life. If they could have skills, even if they were relatively circumscribed and certainly appropriate to their role, they would help them follow on with some of these effective strategies when they're used in WRAP plans. They expressed, to me at least, that that would be a really thrilling thing for their professional development and for their feeling of effectiveness on teams. Okay, so that's the third big idea. Let's quickly go to the fourth. And the fourth is really pretty straightforward. There is an outcomes-based principle of wraparound that is very often not achieved. We think, I personally am very passionate about this, and I think that the evidence from research across healthcare services shows that if you set clear goals and monitor progress and change plans of care as needed, you are going to get better outcomes. So the fourth big idea is not really that big of an idea. It's been in wraparound for years. It's just something that we need more consistent support around doing. So can we make sure that facilitators are using some sort of team-level dashboard to monitor progress and keep the team on track? Certainly, if you're a MAP-trained clinician, you're going to be using the clinical dashboard that Adam's shown different versions of. Could supervisors more consistently use monitoring and feedback in their supervision to make sure that folks stay on track? I don't know what else you'd like to add about that, Adam. Maybe a couple examples or something, but this is just something that's almost a no-brainer, but it does really align with the MAP approach.
I'll see if in just maybe 2 minutes I can show 2 quick examples of this. Thanks, Eric. Next slide, please. Here's just what Eric was talking about, an example of using the dashboard for team communication. And, of course, having a dedicated group for review and evaluation is one of the huge strengths of Wraparound. Down in the blue and white striped area, it's hard to see, but this team is using the dashboard to monitor not just the clinical procedures, but also the team activities. So activities from the different phases are represented on there right along with the clinical practices. And we can see who's doing each activity, too. There's different symbols for care coordinator, clinician, youth specialist, and I can change any of those roles and names because the dashboard should show the information relevant to the decisions your team is making and using your language. There's no one dashboard, just like there's no one map or system model. And all of those activities are lined up in sync with the progress at top. So if things aren't going well, I'll see it quickly and have ideas about what I might try changing. Next slide. Here's one more example of what a dashboard can look like. Obviously, there's a whole bunch more kinds of information included here, but it's also different information. In this case, practices aren't on here at all. Instead, it's other info relevant to the decisions this team was focused on. It shows emotional and behavioral problems at top, followed by child functioning, level of care intensity, and agency involvement. The language is customized for the Hawaii system on this one. That's where this example came from. But you can imagine that swapping out the language and measures relevant to your team, it could be used to monitor the most important questions for you. So the bottom line here is that these are very flexible tools. You can pick them up ready-made or customize them based on the decisions relevant to your team to make for a data-rich environment where we're able to have rapid feedback and self-correction. Next slide, and I'll turn back to Eric.
All right, so just to kind of sum up our big ideas here, so we have these 4 ideas, and our proposed potential enhancement. Again, we haven't tested this out. We're kind of working with a few communities to try out different versions of these things, and we're going to learn as we go. We're going to make our path by walking. But some ideas here about how MAP might specifically work with Wraparound. You want to generate more good ideas for during the planning phase or when you're stuck in implementation. perhaps the map tools like the P-Webs would provide options for generating more good research-based options that just kind of provide a point of discussion for the team and ideas that they could use in their strategizing. Around the supporting clinicians to use effective treatments, well, it's a real straightforward mechanism for achieving that, training and orientation to systems such as MAP that provide this kind of, I think, pretty wraparound congruent approach to doing clinical care that has been shown, this kind of approach has been shown in a randomized trial to be both more palatable to clinicians and more effective for kids. That seems like something that would be worth considering. So that's the second big idea. Training and certifying clinicians who are affiliated with WRAP programs seems like an option. This real exciting idea about family and youth partners and other community supports. Well, can we modify certain of these treatment elements to become care extension strategies, orient and train support staff on this care extender model, and ensure that clinicians and wraparound teams include that kind of follow-on support strategy or strategies that's really explicit in their plans of care. And then finally, can we more consistently use monitoring and feedback to keep ourselves on track? So a couple quick questions. Well, we'll get to the questions at the end. We still have a little bit of time. And what I want to do now, go to the next slide there. Oh, well, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Let's move on. I want to talk to Seth Ashen. We'll come back to this, Nancy, if we have time, all right? So we've got a number of reasons to think that this might work. Like I said, there is randomized studies of modularized approaches that have been found to be more effective and more palatable to clinicians. We have seen the whole state of Hawaii, as Bruce was describing, that's tried a version of what they called the blue menu, or a modularized approach to EBP. And with both wraparound care coordination or wraparound style care coordination, as well as the flexible modularized approach to clinical care, they showed better outcomes over time. We've also seen that MAP just in and of itself can go to scale in big systems. So I don't really have time to go through all of these things. We think there's a lot of research as well as just common sense around it, why it might be something to consider. But right now I want to turn over to ask a few questions of Seth Ashen, who, good afternoon now. Seth, how are you?
Good. Thank you, Eric, for inviting me to the call.
Absolutely. So Seth, just so folks know, is a clinical psychologist, and she's a consultant with Seth Ashen Consulting, and she consults with several wraparound agencies and serves as a wraparound supervisor. She's been a long-time advisor of the National Wraparound Initiative, and it just so happens she is also a MAP trainer and has been involved with PracticeWise for a number of years. So welcome, Seth. Did I characterize who you are correctly?
Perfectly. Thank you so much, Eric.
Great. So what I would like to do is just ask you about your experience doing both wraparound and MAP in the same system with the same family. So how did this come about, and how does that work?
So in my opportunity of being involved with WRAP for the better part of the last decade, and then being a MAP trainer, a few of the agencies, as you said, I have wraparound as programs that I'm able to manage and support. And our WRAP families often really have a diverse set of needs. And our teams, my teams really have the desire, as I'm sure many people on the call, to strategize to meet those needs. So using MAP and some of the MAP tools has really supported the WRAP process in a couple ways. The first, you've already addressed these actually really beautifully and highlighted that it really has helped to address the family-identified mental health needs, as well as the second, to game plan as a team about who's going to be doing what once those mental health needs are met.
So tell us a little bit more about ways this happens. You heard us talk about the four big ideas, and we kind of came up with these, before we started talking with you about your experience, and it was really interesting to hear that you had kind of naturally done a number of these. So have you had experience? The first big idea is using MAP resources in wraparound implementation. When was MAP did you use MAP in in the P-Webs and MAP resources in WRAP implementation explicitly?
Yes. So pretty exciting. So we, one of our teams has had the opportunity to, this is kind of how it's rolled out, and we're still in our infancy in developing and growing learning new ideas as we go and adapting, of course. The process has gone something like this, though, where our teams get together in CFTs, developing the plan of care from a strengths-based, obviously, family voice, family choice, method, and in gaining that information, from the families, identifying what some of the mental health needs are, the team then, the formal supports of the team come back together for what we call a team huddle. And in the team huddle, what we have back at the office with my supervision and support is you have we have the therapist and facilitator, child and family specialist, parent partner, psychiatrists, if they're involved in the case, get together to generate some more ideas, as you all have already kind of discussed. And one of the tools that we go to most frequently at the beginning is the P-Web search. So we'll run a P-Web search, like if you go to the next slide, you'll see that the P-Web search that we run often help us out in giving us more ideas and generating more ideas. I think, Eric, probably the best way to characterize this and to explain it is to just give a brief presentation about a family, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to present a 5-year-old boy whom we'll call Alex, and he's Hispanic. He lives with his bio mom and dad. His bio mom, fabulously nurturing, loving, and has a medical condition that unfortunately limits her mobility. She also has a history of depression. Dad, also a really strong, hardworking guy who takes being a father very, very seriously and works a lot, so he's out of the home a bunch. Alex was removed from the home a couple years ago by DCFS for alleged neglect. He was found, the neighbors reported that he was, as a toddler, walking in the street unattended, probably due to mom's difficulty in terms of her mobility and her medical condition, and dad working so much. So Wraparound was invited to the table when the last few months of foster care, the transition was beginning to happen back home to bio mom and to bio dad. And the arrangement now has been to deliver Alex to grandma's house, and then after school, and then dad after work picks Alex up and brings him home as a plan. And the Wraparound family, the Wraparound team got the family mission pretty quickly that I thought would be important to highlight here. So the overall family mission was they want to be together, and they want to, dad's quote is, I want my boy to do well in school. Mom's quote, I want Alex to follow directions here at home and at school, and I want him to get along with other kids. And Alex's quote is, I want to live with my mommy and my daddy. So altogether, really, they want to be happy here at home together, which is not an uncommon mission for families. And the other mission that was pretty loudly stated was, we want DCFS out of our lives. So let me talk a little bit about Alex's behavior, because that's really, when we look at placement, it's important. So Alex, extraordinarily sweet kid, loves to be a big helper. He's in special ed, and there's a friend of his that's in a wheelchair. He wants to help him in and out of recess, in the chair. But he does need some support in making different choices. So when he's told no by the teacher, often by grandma or mom, he has a history of yelling, screaming, throwing stuff, hitting, crying. He also has some difficulty with his peers using his words when he gets angry. So he was a few months back suspended for choking another kid. So our team question then is, okay, now how can we help Alex as a team? The highlighted need here is Alex needs some help expressing his anger differently. So he also got in trouble with dad because he was being disrespectful with grandma. So, how can we as a team, the next question, how can we as a team help strategize to help him to use more respectful words, What should our action plan be? So the team comes back to the clinic, and we all have our team huddle. And this is where the P-Webs gets pulled out. And the P-Web search, as you see here on the screen, was a search that was, done for Alex. And questions start rolling around our team now, like, knowing this family, which of these interventions here listed in these practice elements might be helpful in moving Alex to a successful spot and using his words more when he gets angry. Which interventions are going to support parents, mom, dad, and grandma, right? And helping Alex to be respectful and uses respectful words, with grandma. So we're collaborating now as a team in a team kind of huddle, generating these ideas using the P-Web search. So things like attending, let's just take that one, pop up. How could we make attending successful for mom and grandma and dad? And what are some of the cultural issues that we need to be sensitive to really individualize that practitioner guideline that Adam went over earlier? How can we individualize that to meet the needs of this family? When the parent partner shares with us that dad's having difficulty showing emotion and affection with Alex, in the same breath he says, but my boy needs to learn how to swim. He's, summer's coming up and we need to teach him how to swim. So right there we have an amazing strength that we can help link, attending with the swimming, and bringing that back to the CFT. So we speak in the huddle about a number of these interventions, always keeping in mind the mission and the values of the parents of Alex. And then we also brainstorm, solutions around making sure that the grandma and dad and mom know they are the MVPs. They're the ones that make Alex want to act the part. They are the ones that Alex looks up to and loves, respects, and motivates his behavior. So there are barriers along the way that we also want to troubleshoot, and brainstorm around, like the parent partner sharing with us that dad lays down the law in the CFT and says he should just listen. I should not have to praise him or spend time with him to make him listen. He should just listen and be respectful. So then we role play that in the group, in the team huddle. And these kinds of opportunities to role play have served to be pretty helpful. The therapist also plays a role here when this P-Web search is done about, what ideas do we have from the P-Web search about what the therapist can do in working with a child and family specialist also at school to help him be calm when he's told no and make different choices. So things like problem solving and relaxation come up as possibilities. And now the most important piece is we've generated all of these ideas and possibilities of how this might play out. There we are now in the CFT, and we get the most important piece is getting buy-in, obviously, from the family about what it is their agenda is. And their agenda is they want to tackle school first. Those school behaviors are the most important. And so that's the piece that we go to, using their lead as the model.
So you threw a few things, a few examples of the ideas of how these could be connected, including how the parent partner was involved, how the team did these huddles. One person from the field asked whether or not this couldn't be done in the context of the full team so that it wasn't something that was excluding the family. Did you ever try that?
We haven't tried doing the P-Web search, if that's what you're asking, right in front of the family, but I'm certainly open to it.
Yeah, one of the things, just kind of an aside, one of the things, we've had this conversation with the couple organizations I'm working with because they're very cognizant of making sure this doesn't become a professionally driven aspect of Wraparound. And so, their thing was that they also saw that, well, if a clinician is a member of the team, they're going to bring their expertise to bear in planning. And so why wouldn't it necessarily be something that would be the role of the clinician to do this and then come in, like you say, to this child and family team and present these options as a more kind of fully participating team member than what you often see with clinicians where they just kind of show up and they say, okay, yeah, well, we're doing our work. It's going fine. So it's an interesting balance that I think needs to be struck on a team-by-team level. What is the family's preference around how this might be done is the conclusion we came to with that Wraparound group I was working with. Absolutely. So we're kind of running out of time. Anything more about how you feel like about that second big idea about clinicians participating on RAP teams being trained on the MAP framework and skills and using the MAP resources? Anything to communicate about how MAP-trained clinicians might make things more effective or more challenging or whatever?
Well, certainly in team coordination, it's been super helpful, as you've pointed out, and also this, the way in which I think RAP has also helped the clinician has been to make more strengths-based goals, and to look at the outcomes in a more strengths-based manner.
Very nice. Around that third big idea, that interesting one about parent and youth partners or paraprofessionals participating in WRAP systems, learning skills that are kind of based on research-based strategies to help them be care extenders. Any ideas about that beyond what you already described for Alex's story?
Well, so in terms of the parent partner, I'm sorry.
Yeah, the parent partners.
Yeah, so, our parent partners have such an important role in the team. They're often the first folks that caregivers will call and often have the least amount of formal training and education. And I've asked them in terms of their feeling about the team huddle process, how that's been, the role plays. They've said very clearly that this has really helped with role definition, practicing, knowing what it is to do in terms of follow-up, and also feeling supported by the other team members.
Very cool. And then finally, this aspect of the monitoring in progress and using dashboards. Have you used dashboards such as the ones that Adam described?
Yeah, so the dashboard, the sharing of the dashboard has been extraordinarily powerful with both the families and the caregivers in Alex's case, and on a couple different notes. But the main payoff here is being able to start a CFT with success and strength. Of wow, look at all the number of times in this last week, Alex, you were able to use your calm words at school. That we're tracking that, and that, Dad and Grandma and Mom are able to both see that on the dashboard, and Alex to hear that publicly in the CFT is also very much in line with the strengths-based approach.
Right. It's very important, as Adam pointed out, to note that you can use any type of dashboard. We've developed one, a monitoring system of our own. The MAP dashboard is very flexible. It's used on a very simple Excel spreadsheet platform. One question was, can others see the dashboard of other teams or other families? That would be totally, up to the local system to figure out how you use these and how you develop a dashboard that would work best for your system. But in terms of the MAP dashboard, this is something that doesn't necessarily have to be, a score from a standardized instrument, but could be things like number of days that Alex was respectful in school or didn't have any discipline issues, etc. So yeah, well, we are just about out of time. The majority of the questions we kind of got to along the way here. A couple of the remaining questions, unless I'm missing any, Janet, are about, again, whether you can get copies of the slides. All you got to do to get copies of the slides or hear the whole video or share it with somebody else if you think others might be interested in the MAP resource or this idea is to go to the NWI website, nwi.pdx.edu, and you can go to the webinar tab and you can download the slides for yourself or forward them to others or watch the video again. I think the other big question here is questions about the expense of MAP, and that's a very it's kind of somewhat complicated question. Adam, can you address the question of how much MAP quote-unquote costs in 15 seconds or less?
Yeah, I'll try to be super brief. One thing is that these resources and tools are available online to anyone who can. The website is on the screen right now, practicewise.com, and anyone can sign on and purchase those resources, quite affordably, something like $200 a year for an individual and less for big groups. And from there, training can be customized as well. You can use it on your own, or you can get this training and certification like we talked about as well. And those costs are customized. You can great to email us for information about that.
So you've got information here about folks you can email about MAP. Eric DeLeiden is there. Actually, these are old. This was from a previous presentation, but you can certainly email me at ebruns@uw.edu. Eric DeLeiden is with PracticeWise if you have specific questions about training. Adam Bernstein and Bruce Chorpita, you can find their contact information on the PracticeWise website, which is up there in front of you there. Janet, did we miss any other burning questions that you saw? I was trying to keep track, but not maybe doing the best job.
No, I think we had a we addressed the issues that were the most commonly. There's a few miscellaneous questions, but I think really I want to congratulate you all on getting through a lot of interesting information in a really interesting way, and I think the relatively small number of questions really is kind of a testament to how clearly the information was presented. And I do think that people can get the follow-up information that they need by checking out the various websites that we've talked about.
Okay, that's great. Well, we want to thank everybody for attending the webinar today. We certainly want to thank Adam and Seth for being part of a power-packed presentation and for trying to pack as much information as possible into very small pieces of time. So thanks to you guys. And if you do have further questions, feel free to email myself, ebruns@uw.edu, and we will get you the information that you need. For now, thank you very much, and we hope that you'll continue to support and participate in some of the activities of the National Wraparound Initiative. Thank you.